So thanks again for the opportunity to speak. And so today I'm going to be talking about an approach to exploring the molecular machine design space, and one that's sort of more immediately applicable and potentially available with MSEP. And so this is going to be sort of leveraging some of the ideas Eric brought forward, but sort of going the other direction. But first, the issue. So there's an absolutely massive design space available for molecular machine design. Compared to steel, it's just enormous. And exploring enormous design spaces, or spaces in general, is a hard problem. And we've done a very bad job at being comprehensive, and only a small amount is actually really thought through, and especially details. An example of this is the iron bridge. It's one of my favorite examples. It's the first bridge built out of iron. And instead of building it the way we'd think about building things out of metal today, they built it as though it was wood because they knew no better. So you see there's dovetail joints and mortar and tenon, and it looks funny to us now, but to them it was the best idea they had. 10 years later, they built a bridge over a larger span at half the weight. By analogy, with molecular machines, especially given that they're so much more different than the transition from wood to steel or wood to iron, like how much did people waiting for the resources to be able to build this massive hulk of a bridge delay their progress versus having better designs that they could have built at an earlier date and increasing the feedback loop of the growth of the industry at the time? Not only that, so the barrier to entry experimentally to explore is really high. You have to have a lab, and as we've seen people talk about, labs are expensive to fund and hard to operate, and everything's very messy. But theoretical designs in MSEP are available, especially now that we have the initial launch. Not only that, we hope to build a big community of people who don't necessarily have the expertise to do nuanced DFT simulations, but they can run MSEP and they'll be able to do simple MD and be able to build conceptual machines that could plausibly work. Also, there's a lot of value in exploring non-optimal paths. And again, I'll make an analogy, but this time to silicon microelectronics. Silicon is not the fastest switch available that we could use. However, it's the best one from a manufacturing perspective because of how easy it is to form a nice, precise oxide layer. This is actually what leads us to use silicon today, even though you may not have thought from first principles that silicon is necessarily the best design. We need to explore a vast design space, especially areas that may not seem to be the perfect machine, but they could actually be the better approach. And so related to this is the quality and quantity of designs. MSEP, for example, uses currently OpenMM, which is a harmonic force field and defined topology. It's not DFT. You won't be able to tell whether your machine's going to do chemistry. However, I don't think that's a problem right now, because I think a bigger issue is we need to get more designs available in people's minds so we can have these arguments about whether it will work. Because I think the argument about whether a design is going to be valid or not is a much better statement, or a much better state to be in, than not actually having anything to talk about in general. It's also just more accessible. If we have a community of amateur designers, we can't expect them to go through the long effort of doing these advanced simulations to figure out in fine detail whether something works, but we can build some momentum early and leverage a community that way. And so the idea, and this is something that Jonathan, HP, and Eric have all been thinking about a long time. I don't claim credit for this. I just want to share it to get everyone else's views and sort of hopefully leave this workshop with an even clearer path on how to implement this. So the MSEP it can be a sandbox right now, and some users love a sandbox and some like some guidance. And so can we have a way to use the MSEP tool to guide people to solve useful problems for the community at large? And I think a first step is very related to what Eric was just talking about, is problem reduction. We need to think from a systems engineering system standpoint to define what I'm going to call canonical design problems. These are problems that you can design very, very clear specifications and measured outputs, and they can be iterated upon, and they might not necessarily be the final design you use, but the existence of this working lets you actually make a refined design for your use case. A good example in electrical engineering is this problem called SERDES, or serialization deserialization. Basically, it's how much data can I put over a channel with how much loss. And you can imagine there's been decades and decades of effort at just a single problem in the abstract, just pushing the boundary further and further and further. We can sort of construct similar canonical design problems in molecular machine design, especially if we look at it from a bigger perspective, and hopefully use some selected problems to at least scout out and sort of get a loose idea of what the design landscape looks like. And so an example could be a bearing. So you could have a design palette. So it's just a quick term made up for this. So you have a constrained set of atoms and the motifs available, as well as the bonds that are allowed to solve a problem. So let's say you have a bearing and you want one outside fixed and the inside to rotate. You can design certain metrics, like if I add a motor of a certain torque, what is the steady state rotational velocity, to be a really quick approximation for friction. Even though it's not ideal, it's still a lot better than having no number. You can also do stiffness. Say, add a motor, look at axial stiffness, look at radial stiffness, and these can be figures of merit that could form leaderboards. And these leaderboards could act similar to Fold It, where people were trying to fold proteins and energy. And so these leaderboards can promote design sharing, and we can have like composite figures of merit. So you can have what's the stiffness times friction to get sort of explore the design space in different ways. And so vision you have is if you have this for enough foundational machine components, you can have this dashboard where you can choose different design palettes, say silicon atoms, carbon atoms, some organic motifs. It can be a lot of variation, and you can sort of look and compare their performance at certain tasks and see, oh, well, this works well for this works well for this, or hey, this palette, I have this available in the lab, and we can kind of do a lot of these things even if it's not ideal. Let's go for it. And so it could be a resource for experimental groups, and we could also have channels for new design palettes to be proposed or new problems to be proposed for members of the community that want more perspective. And so with that, wanted to ask, what do you all think? Do you have ideas for problems you want to look at? Do you have design palettes? Would you want to actually participate in this, or could you benefit in some way? And if we don't have time for questions here, just at any point during this, please hunt me down, and I will be happy to hear any ideas you all have. And with that, thank you.
We actually do have time for at least one question. Anyone? Questions, comments, requests? What to design? Anyone else? Yeah. Andrew, go for it.
So I'd comment that a first goal should not be some, even though small, functional complete system, but something small that an experimental group could conceivably try to make. Just one thing, one motif. What's the test piece?
That's a really good point. And so I think this is sort of where the necessary back and forth with the experimental community is important. The user group doing MSEP are inherently not likely to be experimentalists, at least not have a lot of experimental training. So I don't know if finding that easiest thing for an experimentalist to do is necessarily the best target for this. I think if we can theoretically say, oh, well, you can do all these crazy things, or all these potentially useful things with this palette of atoms later on, that could spur experimental groups saying, oh, well, I can also build with these atoms, given what we have in the lab today, what is the most accessible motif? Because that's such a contextual question to every individual lab. It'd be really hard, especially for a group of users who are non-experts, to attempt to answer that. Although I do see the inherent tension for sure. It's a very hard thing to reconcile.
We're at time, unfortunately, but there will be a workshop group about it, so feel free to ask a question. Thank you, David.
Thank you.